Good evening. My name is Larry Cimino, and I'm the president of the Indiana Council on World Affairs. It's my pleasure at this time to introduce our distinguished speaker, Career Ambassador Bill Brownfield. Ambassador Brownfield is currently serving as senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a bipartisan nonprofit policy research organization in Washington, D.C. Bill Brownfield was promoted to the rank of Career Ambassador in 2012. This is the highest rank in the U.S. Foreign Service. For the last 7 years of his career, he was Assistant Secretary for Drugs and Law Enforcement, a role global in scope, but apropos to this evening, he oversaw massive anti-drug efforts in Colombia and Mexico, crisis management in Central America, and stopping the flow of heroin and fentanyl into the United States, although that probably has more to do with China than Latin America. As ambassador to Chile, he managed a sophisticated relationship with a mature and stable government, leading to the first U.S. free trade agreement in Latin America since NAFTA. In Venezuela, he led an embassy in constant crisis with the most adversarial government of any country in the hemisphere, if not the world. And as ambassador to Colombia, Brownfield ran an embassy engaged in an enormous range of military, security, law enforcement, economic, and humanitarian programs with the Colombian government. In 2008, while in Colombia, he resolved a tense hostage rescue involving 3 Americans, 1 Frenchman, and 11 Colombians, which is the subject of an upcoming book, which I will invite Ambassador Brownfield to tell us a little bit more about later. He received the Secretary's Distinguished Service Award and the Presidential Performance Award 3 times each. A Texas native, he's a graduate of Cornell University and the National War College. He attended the University of Texas School of Law. He speaks Spanish and French, and his wife, Christy Kennedy, is also a career ambassador and previous ambassador to Thailand, the Philippines, and Ecuador. No cushy posting in either of their portfolios. Bill Brownfield has certainly been in the thick of American diplomacy throughout his career. I look forward to his comments. So on behalf of ICWA, I welcome all of you to this evening's program and yield now to Career Ambassador Bill Brownfield.
Thank you, Larry. Ladies and gentlemen, Hoosiers and non-Hoosiers all, one quick correction. You don't need to feel sorry for my wife during her 4 years as ambassador to Thailand. I think she had a very pleasant time in Thailand. That said, if she were here, and I'm not so stupid as to say that, if she were here, she has actually gone out to dinner, taking advantage of my being here with you all this evening. She would have said the same thing about me in Chile, so that's probably a wash. That said, I do want you to feel sorry for me for my 3 years in Venezuela. Let me tell you, those were 3 very long years. Being the U.S. ambassador sent by then President George Bush to Hugo Chavez's Venezuela made for a very complicated assignment for me. But that is not the purpose of my discussion this evening. Let me get on point. I would like to talk to you for about 15 minutes or so, and then I promise I will turn this conversation over to you, or at least over to Larry, who will determine who else will be speaking to. Let me start this way. A little over 6 months ago, you may recall this, there was an election here in the United States of America. And as is always the case, large numbers of issues were political and campaign issues in the course of our seemingly endless, but let's say roughly 1 year of election campaigning before the November elections. And all sorts of issues came up, including in the foreign affairs realm. There was much discussion about relations with Russia, relations with China, relations with Iran and the so-called Iran nuclear deal. They talked about NATO and other US alliances, or the United Nations and the international organizations around the world. They talked about climate change. What was one issue they did not talk about? Latin America was not a campaign issue in the year 2020. To the extent that the issue was addressed at all between the 2 major candidates, it focused on one specific issue, and that is the crisis or the problems or the issues at the US southwest border between the United States and Mexico. And even there, they focus largely on the border itself and not the underlying issues that generated the discussion to begin with. We are now 4 months, or nearly 4 months, into this new administration. And may I remind you all, just in case you need reminding, that the first foreign crisis that this administration had to deal with was, wait for it, a Latin America crisis. Tens of thousands of citizens from 3 Central American countries seeking to transit Mexico and enter the United States of America without documentation or approval from the government. Ladies and gentlemen, my point is very simple at the start. It doesn't matter if we're talking about the George Washington administration or the Joe Biden administration or any of the administrations in between. A Latin America crisis, challenge, or opportunity will present itself regularly in the course of this administration. And I can tell you that some will be driven by old traditional issues, at least in the modern era of US relations with its Latin American neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. Issues such as migrants and migrant movement, or drugs, or other smuggling issues such as firearms going south or illegally mined product coming north. It might involve trade and economic investment throughout the region. These days, it could include refugees. There are more than 5.5 million refugees today located in or near Latin America, and may I suggest that nearly 1.5 million of them are currently located in the United States of America, heavily concentrated in South Florida. But ladies and gentlemen of Indiana and the larger Midwest, I give you an absolute promise that there are some in your state and your region as well. And to be topical and current, pandemics. One of the things that happens when you have millions of refugees or hundreds of thousands of migrants that are crossing the border without proper regulation and entry permit is the spread of any disease that they might be carrying, such as COVID or any other pandemic that might be out there. Ladies and gents, even if we ignore the fact that today, in the year 2021, there are more than 50 million, that's 50 million American citizens who are in fact Hispanic Americans, overwhelmingly from Latin America. A few, I acknowledge, are probably from Spain itself, but ignore that and you are ignoring the largest ethnic minority in the United States of America. Latin America is branded, engraved, tied into US foreign policy. It always has been, it is, and it always will be. I would like to talk about many of the possible crises and some of the possible opportunities to come in terms of US relations in the Western Hemisphere. But I'm going to pick 3 that I would classify for you as inevitable that this Biden administration will have to deal with. And then when I'm finished with that, you can take me to the races wherever you might wish, so long as you stay within the hemisphere. Inevitable crisis number 1, Mexico and Central America. I've already mentioned it. It's there. It is not going away. And it is in fact much more complicated than just tens of thousands of human beings arriving at the border. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a native son, as Larry mentioned, of the Lone Star State of Texas. And I speak with considerable authority here when I tell you that the US has had a very complicated relationship with Mexico for more than 180 years. And every time the two governments talk to one another, either directly or indirectly, some elements of that relationship work their way into the conversation. This is why it's not a simple matter to control, if you will, the flow of migrants that start south of Mexico and process all the way through the Republic of Mexico before reaching the US border. And it's migrants, it's drugs, it's health issues related to the pandemic. And the root causes, ladies and gentlemen, are in fact located in Central America. They are matters such as poverty, which makes people willing to drop whatever they have been doing for their entire lives and pack a bag and head north. It is security and violence. The fact that Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador all rank probably in the top 10% of violent countries that are not actually at war and engaged in combat. It is corruption, which basically eats into and hollows out a population's trust and confidence in their own government. And it is humanitarian and human rights issues as well. At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, the Mexico, Central America, US crisis is a crisis at the border because that's where it first comes into direct contact with the United States of America. But the root causes are in fact located in Central America and are a complicated mix, if you will, of economic and social developmental issues and security and law enforcement issues. That's crisis one. Crisis number two, Venezuela, a country I know especially well. Why is it a crisis? Why is it an inevitable crisis for the Biden administration, you might ask? Thank you for asking, because I acknowledge it's located in South America. You can't swim there. You can't even drive there because they haven't finished the highway through the Darien Gap in Panama. These days, it's almost impossible to fly there. There's almost no movement whatsoever, at least lawful movement, between Venezuela and the United States of America. So why, Smarty Pants, are you saying, should we be concerned and expect to have to deal with a crisis? Is it just because the current government of Venezuela is an authoritarian, dictatorial, human rights violating, economy destroying, grotesquely corrupt government, perhaps the most corrupt in the entire world? Yes, I acknowledge it is all of those things, but you could probably point to a number of other countries in the world that meet those five categories as well. And I'm not going to suggest to you that they are going to be inevitable crises for the United States of America. Venezuela is an inevitable US crisis because there are today 5.5 million Venezuelans who have fled their nation, and they are seeking refuge wherever they can find it. Many of them are finding it in the United States, and those that are not are becoming tremendously destabilizing populations in other countries in Latin America. It is inevitable because Venezuela today has, believe it or not, the worst public health care system in the hemisphere and one of the worst in the world. And what is happening now in Venezuela? COVID has arrived. 5.5 million, which could grow to 10 million in the course of the next 2 years, who have received virtually no health care whatsoever. Does anyone see a potential problem there? Perhaps I do. Regional instability. You cannot park millions of people in neighboring countries, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, Panama, and not expect to have major problems in terms of crime, law enforcement, security, hunger, poverty, you name them, that they are likely to be there. Virtually 90% of all the drugs that leave Colombia, still the world's largest cocaine producing nation in the world, transit through Venezuela. Let me rephrase that. If they leave by air or by ground, the majority still go by sea from northern Colombia, but if they haven't gone by sea, they have almost assuredly transited Venezuela, and many of them are coming here. But let me conclude with my last reason why Venezuela is an inevitable crisis for the United States of America, and that is it has been discovered not just by us, it has been discovered by our very good friends, the Russian Republic and the People's Republic of China. And we can have a long discussion, and hope we will, I hope we will, in terms of what is actually attracting them there. But I suggest to you that their growing presence there is not good news for the United States of America. Crisis number 3, and this may surprise some of you. I suggest it is Colombia. And it may, or at least it should surprise many of you, because Colombia, over the last 20 years, has been Latin America's principal success story, thanks significantly to a huge amount of support by the United States of America through 1, 2, 3, 4, we're now in the 5th administration. I think I got that right. Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden. $13 billion of US assistance that was provided to Colombia to address a late 20th century economic crisis, security and guerrilla crisis, and finally a law enforcement, drug and organized crime crisis. And in fact, it succeeded. Colombia today is a leader in Latin America. Other countries look to it as a model in terms of how to solve their own problems and their own crises. We are today, however, engaged in a major review by both governments, the Colombian and the US, in terms of our relationship. For 20 years, Colombia was a nation whose nose was just barely above water, fighting to survive, fighting to avoid becoming a failed state. Well, ladies and gents, they succeeded. They are the greatest success story in Latin America in the last, I suppose I would say, 50 years of history. And the issue that we're now wrestling with, both in Washington and in Bogota, is how does this relationship change or shift as we go from us, in a sense, assisting a government and a nation that is desperate for assistance to a more balanced relationship between two partners. And how we do this, ladies and gentlemen, will have an enormous impact, not just on US-Colombia relations. It is in fact going to have an influence and an impact on our relationship with virtually every country in South America, in Central America, and in a big chunk of the Caribbean. Watch this space. The truth of the matter is the United States of America invested $13 billion into a positive relationship with Colombia. And I submit to you, it is in our interest to make sure that relationship continues to pay dividends both for Colombia and for the United States of America. Ladies and gentlemen, I conclude. And I conclude by saying to the Biden administration, but through you, the World Affairs Council of Indiana, we ignore Latin America and Latin American issues in the United States at our own peril. I would remind you that we have a phenomenal amount of trade and direct foreign investment between the United States and the larger Latin American community in the Western Hemisphere. I would remind you that the most serious law enforcement and organized crime threats that the United States of America deals with that are not domestic in nature come to or through Latin America. If our biggest threat right now in terms of illicit drugs in the United States is fentanyl, fentanyl is produced overwhelmingly in China, but it enters the United States of America through Mexico, a Latin American country. If our second leading concern in terms of drug abuse in the United States today is heroin, more than 90% of all the heroin that is consumed in the United States comes not from Afghanistan, the world's largest producer. No, it comes from Mexico. If your concern is cocaine, 100% of the cocaine consumed in the United States is produced in one of three Latin American countries, Colombia, Peru, or Bolivia. If you wish to ignore that, you are ignoring the principal issues of drug abuse in the United States today, with the exception, of course, of diverted opioids, which we can all proudly say, congratulations to the United States of America. That is a domestic industry. We produce opioids ourselves. But other than that, every single dangerous product that is out there in terms of drug abuse has either a Latin American origin or a Latin American entry point into the United States. We ignore Latin America at our own peril if we ignore the humanitarian and human rights issues that generate hundreds of thousands of migrants and millions of refugees. And ladies and gentlemen, if those aren't enough reasons to convince you that we must not ignore our neighbors, partners, and fellow occupants of the Western Hemisphere in Latin America, let me offer you one more reason. 50 million Hispanic American citizens of the United States of America. They will not let you ignore Latin America. That's my opening pitch, Larry. I'm prepared to turn this conversation over to you now. Take it away, brother, but be gentle.
Thank you, Ambassador Brownfield. That's a great platform from which we can leap into some additional questions. The way we've structured this program is that we'll divide the balance of the time between some structured questions which I've prepared and opening it up to the group. Now, we welcome questions from the group. What I would suggest, though, is that you go to that chat button. If you push on it, the lower left, there's a little blue box. It probably says to everyone right now. If you poke the little arrow, a bunch of names will come up. But click my name so that I see it. You don't need to send your questions to everybody. Send them to me. It's Larry Cimino, C-I-M-I-N-O. You'll find me there. And I'll be taking a look at those as we go. I'd like to start by asking you to talk a little bit more about Venezuela. I see a number of questions that have come up which overlap with my own interests. I really wonder if you see any solution to the endless crisis in Venezuela. And I also heard from our friend Marco Dominguez, who is from Venezuela, interacts with us regularly. And Mariori Duarte Sheffield had also asked a little bit about, do you see any prospect for peace? And it's interesting because they're asking, what's the opposition from within Venezuela to remove the president? And why doesn't the rest of the world and the hemisphere, as you pointed out, they're all being affected by what's going on there? Why is Maduro still in place? And how do you think this crisis can be resolved, or can it be resolved?
Yep. Larry, let me give you a two-part answer. The first part is going to be a very, very simple answer. In the long term, I am extremely optimistic about a successful solution to the Venezuela crisis, which, by the way, is now more than a crisis. It's a tragedy. It's gone from a problem to a severe problem to a crisis to a tragedy. when you have I mean, I can go through the list of all the reasons why Venezuela's community and society and economy has completely collapsed. But the reason I am optimistic is, as a wise ambassador said sometime back between 2004, 2007 in Venezuela, whoever that fellow was, he said, ladies and gentlemen, we have read this book before. We know how it ends. We have seen it in the former Soviet Union. We have seen it in those countries that formerly comprised the Warsaw Pact or were behind the Iron Curtain. We have seen what happens when a small group of people comprise a self-declared political party, accumulate all power, and then become corrupted by that power and literally criminalize their government. The structure will eventually collapse. It cannot sustain itself. So I say to all of you, Venezuela will eventually evolve by some means into a transition. What I cannot tell you is exactly when we get to the final chapter. Do I have to get through 200 pages or 2,000 pages? And I cannot tell you exactly what the final chapter looks like. Is it violent and bloody? Is it a negotiated transition? Is it just a collapse and total chaos for a period of time? All of those are possible. But at the end of the day, and I say this particularly to any Venezuelans or Venezuelan Americans who are on this Zoom session right now, we must think in the long term. We must be confident in the long-term solution, ready to support a short-term solution, but planning for a longer-term solution. Okay, where are we? And I'll try to hold it to only about a minute on this complicated issue. First, we are talking about a state, a country, and a population that are literally in free fall. Highest homicide rate in all of the Western Hemisphere and close to the entire world. At times, the highest inflation rate in the entire world. Transparency International now ranks them either at the bottom or the bottom 2 or 3 countries in terms of governmental corruption. Crime rate is horrible. The public health system has completely collapsed. There is no functional economy today in Venezuela. In fact, the currency no longer has value when you consider that it takes maybe 10 million bolivars to give you the buying power of a nickel. You can imagine what this means if you have to go use Venezuelan currency in order to buy a week's worth of groceries. You need to have a wheelbarrow just to bring in all of the million bolivar notes that you would have to pay, and then wait for an hour and a half while it gets counted. I mean, the economy has dollarized, not because Mr. Maduro and his government loves the United States of America, but because there is no alternative. So where are we heading? We as the international community, and that is not a monolithic institution, but nevertheless, we're dealing with the issue, if you will, from maybe 4 different concentric circles. The closest circle are the immediate neighbors to Venezuela. And they are, it's a fairly short list, they are Brazil, Colombia, to a certain extent Trinidad, which does not really wish to engage, and the United States of America. We're a neighbor, by the way, because the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico do in fact have a maritime border with Venezuela and Venezuela's some of Venezuela's island possessions, and we're working together in terms of things that we can do literally as neighbors, and we tend to be fairly hard line in terms of what the approach should be. A broader approach is called the Lima Group, which is, I believe, now a group of about 14 Latin American nations. The United States is not formally a member by choice. That said, we participate in every meeting and every discussion. And these are the Latin American countries who are in many ways affected by Venezuela, mostly by refugee populations, but in other ways as well. And they are working to maintain some degree of pressure on the Maduro regime in the hopes that it will eventually generate some sort of transition. Broader than that is the OAS, which incorporates all of the countries of the Western Hemisphere, brings in the North Americans as well as the Caribbeans, as well, obviously, as the South and Central Americans. And there you find there is about a 2/3 majority that are prepared to support a fairly firm line with Mr. Maduro, and about 1/3 that either do not wish to intervene, or 2 or 3 nations that actually, or governments that actually support the Maduro regime. And then the broadest of all is the United Nations and the international community. The problem there is they have the authority. The Security Council actually can talk about security matters and pass resolutions which will compel compliance. But the Security Council also has 5 governments that have the right of veto, and 2 of them are named Russia and China. And we can rest assured, I believe, that no clear resolution on Venezuela that actually brings real pain to the Maduro government is likely to survive a Russia or China veto in the Security Council. Where are we headed? And I'm concluding now. My own view for the last 3 years, ever since I was liberated by retiring from active service in the State Department and finally able to express my views more clearly, is that it is essential to have, if you will, a carrot and a stick. And you got to have a lot of sticks with the Maduro government. It is, in fact, one of the more repugnant and repulsive governments in the world today. So I actually support sanctions. I think that's a good idea. Sanctions alone cannot be a policy, however. I believe you've also got to name and shame. I support the decision, not just by the United States, but several other countries to indict and seek the extradition or otherwise acquire jurisdiction over senior members of the Venezuelan government who have stolen billions of dollars from the Venezuelan people. I think that is a good idea. I think it is a good idea for the Venezuelan regime to have to be concerned as to what the neighbors might be doing. These are all matters of applying some degree of pressure. On the positive side, there is a constitutional interim government inside Venezuela today. The interim president, who is there in that role by virtue of the Constitution, which was written, promulgated, and ratified under then President Hugo Chavez. It was literally his constitution, which said, in the event that the office of presidency is vacant, then the head of the National Assembly, their legislative branch, becomes the interim president until new elections can be scheduled. The Legislative Assembly, the National Assembly, declared in the year 2018 that Mr. Maduro's election had been fraudulent, which it was, and therefore he was not the constitutional president of Venezuela. And the then president of the National Assembly was Juan Guaido. So it's not like he self-declared himself in this position. He is there because of the Constitution. There is an alternative. And of course, dialogue and negotiation is a better way to go than confrontation and possible violence. But I would close by reminding everyone that every time the international community has entered into or supported a dialogue, a negotiation, a discussion with the Maduro government, 2 things have occurred. 1, the Maduro government did not comply with its agreements and emerged in a stronger position. 2, the interim government of Juan Guaido did comply and emerged in a weaker position with less credibility and more divisions within the movement. Long-term, optimistic. Short-term, we've got to plan for the long-term and continued strategy of both offering the carrots, but meanwhile, whacking them with a stick.
Okay. Next question I have, and is kind of reinforced by some of the questions that are coming in from a couple of our guests. Is really, can we solve the Southwest border crisis without a long-term solution to Central America's problems? And what might such a solution look like? I have a question from April Rank, who wants to know if a Marshall Plan for Central America is a reasonable way to approach things. And David Perez wants to know if corruption is just really the basic problem. And if that's the case, who do you negotiate with when you're trying to solve the problems in Central America?
Yeah, fair points. And I'm now speaking with some authority and I guess a little bit of dried blood on my head. I'm compelled to admit that in 2015, 2016, I was kind of the guy who was stuck in the last 2 years of the Obama administration, when I was Assistant Secretary for Drugs and Law Enforcement, with implementing at least the security and law enforcement side of our efforts at that time to address the root causes of the crisis in Guatemala, in Honduras, and in El Salvador, which we here in the United States frequently refer to as a Northern Triangle, although they dislike that enormously down there because they note correctly that there are dramatic differences between the three countries. Lumping them together kind of ticks them off. I would say that the root causes in Central America fall into categories. One are the economic and social categories, which is to say the lack of employment and the lack of jobs, the pitiful infrastructure, the lack of proper health care and education. In short, the things that give a person or a family a stake in wanting to stay in their community, their city, their town, their village, or their farm, because they can't earn a decent living. And that requires, if you will, an economic and social development solution, which is very much kind of what the Marshall Plan was designed to be in the late 1940s in Europe. The second half of the push factors, which is what's driving people out of Central America and making them head north to the U.S. border, are what I'd call the security and crime and violence problems. And corruption is kind of the facilitator. It's the grease that makes the violence and the crime work. But it is not in and of itself the actual driver of the violence and the crime. There are enormous gang problems, particularly in Honduras and El Salvador. By the way, anyone who lives, say, in Indianapolis, if you want to see what a Central American gang looks like, go check with your local police. I'll bet you, I'll give you 100 to 1 odds that one of the Central American gangs, there are basically two that are of any significance. One is called Calle 18 or 18th Street, and the other is called MS-13. And since they actually originated in the Salvadoran community in Los Angeles, the one in California, in the 1980s, in many ways, they then, as they drifted back to Central America, they brought their gang structure with them, and then they have transited back into the United States in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And the gang violence in some places in that region is tremendous. I mean, is it facilitated by corruption? Of course it is, but it's the gangs themselves that are doing it. And you have organized crime as well. Gangs are kind of organized, but they're not an economic entity per se. The trafficking organizations are an economic entity, and they are very much a part of the problem. And they blend together with the gangs in terms of making life impossible, in some cases literally, for those who live in these Central American countries. Then you put all of this together, and you have an enormous amount of push factor, which is pushing hundreds of thousands of Central Americans into leaving their own countries. Any place would be better than here. The question was, is there a way to solve the Southwest border problem without solving Central America? And theoretically, there is. I mean, it would require a major effort on the part of Mexico. It could be done. Will it be done? I seriously doubt that. I mean, Mexico does not wish, in a sense, to become the enforcer, as it sees it, for its neighbor to the north, they will facilitate to some extent and control better their southern border, which is about 1/10 the size of the northern border, the Mexican northern border with the United States. But from their perspective, the solution they would like to see in Mexico is, in fact, more development assistance and to some extent more security assistance for the Central American three nations. My guess is we're going to get there. What we have to be careful about, first, are political realities. How much stomach does the United States Congress have for a gigantic assistance program for the three nations in Central America? My guess is some, but not a tremendous amount. Politically, it's always easier to sell a program to strengthen and modernize your own border than it is to provide foreign assistance to countries that are 1,500 miles away with another country in between them. But I suspect we'll see some support there. We must be careful that we do not ignore the corruption, because nothing will destroy a foreign assistance program more thoroughly and quickly than to leave the perception, and not to mention the reality, that most of the assistance is being sliced off by corrupt government officials and is not allowed to get to the communities where it is supposed to do the actual work.
So, Bill, you mentioned government aid, but what do American politicians and the American people in general, do they think about direct foreign investment and free trade agreements as a zero-sum kind of a game, that if we give it to them, it's going to raise our taxes, it's going to cost U.S. jobs and salaries, and and from the soft side of it, what do we have our embassies staffed in those countries, and are they working with the government to try to resolve some of these problems? And can they? Is this a possibility? Do we have trained career diplomats in those countries, or do we have people who bought their way into it wouldn't be a cush assignment, and that's this case, but so many of those jobs have been filled previously by non-professional kinds of folks who aren't trained to do the kind of soft diplomacy that our ambassadors were trained to do in the past.
Yeah, Larry, let me offer you a little bit of personal history, and it helps to answer kind of, I think, that your larger question. I first served in Central America 1981 to 83. It was my second assignment in the Foreign Service, and I was a third secretary and the labor attaché at our embassy in El Salvador. At that time, those of you who are old enough will recall that Ronald Reagan came to office in January of 1981, and he was determined. He literally said he was going to draw a line in the sand. In those days, it was the Soviet Union who had, in President Reagan's opinion, by the way, which I agree with, but that's old history. That's 40 years ago. That the Soviets had managed to succeed in ingratiating themselves with the government of Nicaragua, and Reagan said they're going to go no further, and they didn't. And at that time, our embassies in Central America were extremely well staffed, although they were frequently on a virtual wartime footing. The first 6 months I was in El Salvador, for example, there was a 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew, and it was enforced aggressively. I mean, like shoot to kill if you were out there in the streets at that particular point in time. And when we came, the embassy staff, when we came in to work in the morning, we were required to carry what we called a day bag. And in that day bag was a change of clothes, plus whatever, a toothbrush and stuff, in the event that we had to be evacuated from the roof of the embassy building by helicopter in the course of the day. They didn't want to have to worry about us complaining that we got no underwear and we can't even brush our teeth. That was the situation when I got there in 1981. And I would suggest to you that the 1980s and early 1990s was the Latin America Bureau of the State Department at its finest. It was in fact a very complicated problem set. It involved security issues, but it involved a whole lot of economic assistance. And by the early 1990s, in fact, there had been peace agreements everywhere in Central America, and elections basically were creating the new governments. In other words, it's what we wanted. What did we then do? Because we are, after all, the government of the United States of America, and Paris thought that we should actually learn a long-term lesson from any experience. We then kind of began to draw down our embassies in Central America, and they became, by the first decade of this century, much smaller and almost backwater posts, partly because the aggressive and competitive and ambitious foreign service officers didn't really want to serve there. That's not where the cool stuff was happening. They wanted to go to Colombia or have a good life in Argentina or Brazil, or maybe go to Haiti because things are happening there. Then we get into this last decade, starting sometime around 2012, 2013, when we discover at our southwest border tens of thousands of Central Americans who are in fact crossing the Rio Grande or further west, crossing into New Mexico, Arizona, or California. And we look down at our embassies and we say, wow, golly, we're not actually staffed to handle a major surge. Now, the good news is we're there again. The truth of the matter is, I think we spent much of the last 6 or 7 years getting those embassies once again properly staffed with the right people, putting serious ambassadors there and not people who are there for their retirement posting, and actually having people that are capable of managing a complicated project. That's the good news. The bad news is, and I've said this, during my 2 years when I kind of managed most of this, and I was forced to trudge over every 2 months to a meeting in the private office of the then Vice President of the United States. Have I mentioned this was 2015, 2016, where since no one else was prepared to talk back to him, I had to be the one who would say to him every 2 months, Mr. Vice President, it has taken us 20 years to get into this mess, and it's going to take more than just a couple of months to get out of it. He did not like that answer. He made that clear to me. I am fortunately now retired, so I do not have to go over to that same individual in a different office right now. And I would have to say exactly the same thing. Ladies and gentlemen of the Indiana World Affairs Council, this is a long-term problem. Yes, we can have some impact, and it's going to be gradual. It's going to be evolutionary, but we're not going to solve it per se until we have completed work, but serious and intelligent work in terms of our own border controls and border processes, until we have developed a common understanding and agreement with the government of Mexico in terms of what we will do, what they will do, and what our mutual expectations are. And finally, that not until we have a serious economic and social development and foreign assistance program in those 3 countries, combined with a serious security. But when I say security, I mean law enforcement. I'm not talking about the Army or the Navy. That's not where the problem is going to be solved. I am talking about properly trained and equipped police officers. I am talking about prosecutors and defense attorneys who actually know how to do their job. I'm talking about judges and courts that function. I'm even talking about a correction system that actually constitutes a rehabilitation system, and for those who cannot be rehabilitated, a place where they are incarcerated, as opposed to the current system, which is they process through for 6 months to go to a graduate school on organized criminal activity, and then pop out 6 months later, better trained and better able to do either gang work or organized crime. That's what I say when what I mean when I say this is going to be a long-term effort.
Good. I have one more question, and it dovetails with some of the things that have come in about the influence of China's Belt and Road Initiative and Russian election meddling, which seem to be everywhere. How serious is this in Latin America? And sort of a secondary question, are we seeing vaccine diplomacy in Latin America by either of those characters? And is the US doing anything in that regard in Latin America? Does that propose an opportunity for us?
Yep. Let me start at least with the first issue of Russia and China in Latin America. And I am going to say to you with uncharacteristic honesty and directness, it is more serious from the U.S. perspective than I have ever seen in Latin America. And I have been engaged in Latin America since 1979. So that's 42 years. When I first went to Latin America in 1979, by the way, if I could, as an aside, to indicate just how far we have progressed, there were exactly 4 non-military governments in Latin America. Can you believe that? In 1979, which is during my lifetime, and those 4, by the way, were Mexico, Costa Rica, Colombia, and Venezuela in those days. They had civilian elected governments. Every single other country was under military government. So do not tell me that we have made no progress whatsoever in the Western Hemisphere. But I digress. Let me get back to Russia and China. In those days, you would have found a Soviet embassy, which is what it was called then, in maybe 5 or 6 of the largest countries of Latin America. No presence anywhere else except Cuba, obviously, which had an enormous presence, and Nicaragua. China, even less. I mean, when I was in Argentina, which is my 3rd assignment, that was in the mid to late 1980s, the Chinese embassy was maybe 8 or 10 people, and I couldn't actually figure out what they did. They were largely invisible. I mean, they were a presence just to be able to say that they were there. Flash forward 40 years later. And the truth of the matter is, for different reasons, Russia and China are major players in all of the Western Hemisphere. The Russians, and I'll say it quite succinctly and quite bluntly, I think are playing a geostrategic game with the United States of America. They have no real long-term interest of their own in Latin America, even in Venezuela, where they are the second major international player, second only to Cuba in terms of size of presence. Venezuela, if it ever were able to get its economy going again, is an oil-producing nation. I mean, that's why people would have interest in Venezuela. Russia is an oil exporting nation. It obviously has no particular need for or desire for Venezuelan oil. The Russians are in Venezuela and elsewhere in Central America because they do not like what we are doing in their mind in countries that are closer to Russia or Russia's perceived sphere of influence. We have to be fairly clear with ourselves. That is why Russia is there. It is directly to poke us in the eye. And quite frankly, I'm sure if we told them we're prepared to give up on all those countries which have desperately been trying to establish democracies in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, my guess is you could cut a deal with Mr. Putin fairly quickly. China is more complicated. China actually does have commercial interests in Latin America. China has become Chile, which is perhaps the most highly developed economy in all of Latin America, and Peru, which is a major mining country, as is Chile. China, I think, is now their leading trade partner. And it's basically it's raw materials, which they acquire from those Pacific nations. In Venezuela, they are responsible for keeping Venezuela's oil industry afloat to the extent that it is. I mean, it's now about less than 10% of what it was at the time Mr. Chavez came to office in 1999. But to the extent that anyone is buying Venezuelan oil because they want it and need it, it is China, which obviously requires a substantial amount of oil for its economy. At the end of the day, we have to take this into account. Now, is both Russia and China trying to use vaccines, COVID vaccines, as a means to ingratiate in Latin America? Yes, it is. Were we a bit behind the 8 ball in terms of not being prepared to provide vaccines at the same time? Yes, although I think I apologize to no one for that. To the best of my knowledge, first Donald Trump and now Joe Biden were elected, I believe, by the people of the United States of America. There was some concern that we were losing, and I believe we're now approaching 600,000 dead Americans. Put that in perspective, That's about 50% more than the number of Americans who died in the Second World War. In fact, I think it begins to approach the total number of Americans who died in all of our wars combined, if you exclude the Civil War, where we proved to be much more capable of killing each other than we were in the wars with other countries and other powers. And I therefore say, yes, I understand why the decision was made to not provide vast amounts of US developed vaccine until we had largely addressed our own vaccination requirements. But you know, based upon what I heard today from the CDC, from the White House, it looks like we're pretty much deciding that we're there. And my guess is, and I certainly would say my hope is, we are going to start to make some of the surplus available to the Western Hemisphere. The timing is still good, and I will tell you why, Larry. The biggest nation, the nation that bought the biggest blob of the Chinese vaccine was Chile. They could do it because, in fact, they were a middle-class country. I mean, which is a very well-run economy and a well-run government. And they, in fact, have vaccinated an even higher percentage of their population than we have. I think they're at somewhere between 60 and 65% at this point, because they only had access about 4 or 5 months ago to the Chinese vaccine. That is what they bought. Do you know what they are discovering today, Larry, ladies and gentlemen of the World Affairs Council? They're discovering that it provides an immunity rate somewhere between 30 and 40%, as opposed to, say, Moderna or Pfizer, which, as we know, is up somewhere between 90 and 95%. They're not really pleased about that, having forced their nation to get themselves vaccinated. This, in my opinion, is a good time, a good opportunity, when we find that we've got more supply than we need, to start pushing it on a systematic basis to our neighbors, particularly those in whom we have confidence they will use it well and correctly. It's never too late to do vaccine diplomacy, particularly if those who went in the first time provided defective product. Those are my views on Russia and China and the hemisphere. But I say to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, that we've got to pay attention to this. I mean, we have become accustomed, and correctly, for the last, I don't know, 150 years, to being kind of the lead player among the major global powers in the hemisphere. It is our hemisphere. It's where we live as well. It is logical that we would be the major players. And I am concerned at the size of the presence of Russia and China today. It's not yet a desperate matter. We still have a very good hand to play, but it is important that we play it and that we tell our elected leaders that we hope they are paying attention to this and are prepared to play our own hand in the Western Hemisphere intelligently.
Good. Well, we have a number of questions from folks now, and I want to make sure that you're sending in your questions. I want to mostly read some of the questions that have come in. A number of things about the largest country in Latin America, Brazil, and from a number of people, but I want to turn it over to one of our members who is from Brazil, Rich Pilnick. And Rich, can you unmute yourself and ask your question? Are you there still? Don't know if we've lost Rich.
Okay, I'm there.
There, good.
I hear the voice.
Ambassador, thank you for your time and for your thoughts. I do have a question on Brazil. You know, there's huge attrition between the Bolsonaro administration and the various branches of the government, the Senate, the House. There's incredible changes and complications in his own cabinet. You know, he's had 4 ministers of health during this pandemic. Recently, there's been a complete change in the leadership of all the branches of the armed forces. And there's even division within the Supreme Court that's become much more of a political influence. What are the implications for the US?
Yeah. Let me start by acknowledging I did not put Brazil in my category of the three most certain, most inevitable crises in the hemisphere that the Biden administration will have to deal with. Not because I don't believe there are likely to be some, but because Brazil, in my opinion, and it may well be yours, I suspect it certainly is out of about 200 million Brazilians, is that Brazil, at the end of the day, Brazil is going to address its issues as it wishes. It is a nation. It is the largest nation in Latin America, the second largest nation in the Western Hemisphere. And I don't know, I'm guessing it's like in terms of population, in the top 6 or 7 nations in the world. No nation is going to come in with an assistance program or an anti-corruption program or a stiff diplomatic note and is actually going to have a national impact on Brazil. I mean, a Plan Colombia type approach to Brazil, if we put 13 billion into Colombia, we're talking to have the same amount of impact. We're probably talking about 100 billion plus for Brazil, which is simply not realistic. Now, having said that, is Brazil inevitably going to have some complicated issues as this year and next year goes on? Yes, I think we're in the midst of it. You talked about the healthcare, the health crisis. No matter how you say it, I don't believe anyone would suggest that managing the pandemic has been a particularly positive effort on the part of the government, of the national government of Brazil. I'm not going to point fingers. I'm not going to name anyone specifically. I am going to say to you that 25 years from now, as Brazilian historians look back in time and they assess the Bolsonaro government, I think it's highly unlikely that they will classify their management of the COVID crisis as a positive or high point. The current Brazilian government is different from, dramatically different from virtually any other elected government of Brazil that I can think of, certainly in my lifetime. In many ways, that's good. I think shaking things up is often a good thing, and I agree with those who have been mildly critical about the Brazilian government for, in a sense, having institutions that are strong and quite independent, but are not particularly responsive necessarily to large numbers of the Brazilian people, whether it's their foreign ministry or their other economic and law enforcement and social ministries. They have taken criticism for that in the past. And I believe some degree of shaking up kind of every generation or so is a good idea. Is this the way I would have suggested would work best for Brazil? I wouldn't necessarily say that. On the other hand, if you look at another country that I'm very much concerned about, Venezuela, I would say the current government of Brazil has been an extremely positive partner in terms of trying to address the Venezuela crisis. Perhaps one reason being that several 100,000 of those Venezuelan refugees have found their way into Brazil, despite the fact they don't speak a word of Portuguese and have no real relatives or family at all in Brazil. Brazil, ladies and gentlemen, is unique in Latin America. It's unique because of its size, the size of its population, the size of its economy, health, the size, its geographic size, occupying a rather substantial chunk of the entire South American continent. It will always be an important issue for the United States of America because it is Brazil, the largest and most important nation in all of Latin America. but I will always be positive and sympathetic. And do you know why? I'll tell you, even though you didn't ask me. I'm in Washington, D.C. Our baseball team is called the Washington Nationals. In the year 2019, for the first time in 95 years, they won the stinking World Series. And do you know who their catcher was in that World Series? I'll tell you. His name is Yan Gomes. And you know where he was born and raised? Brazil. I think he may be the only Brazilian baseball player in the major leagues. And I will forgive anything Brazil does for having sent us Yan Gomes. And you can quote me on that.
Thank you.
Next, I'm going to call on someone who's a visitor to our program this night from Ithaca, New York. This is Seth Seacroft. And Seth, I want you to unmute yourself and you can ask your question. I think you want to stir the pot a little bit, perhaps. Are you there, Seth? You have to unmute yourself. Well, I will come back to you, Seth. Figure out where your unmute button is, and hopefully you're still on. I'm going to go to someone who's calling in from the East Coast, Jay Wright Witcher, who has a question. I would like Jay Wright to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Ambassador Brownfield. It's a pleasure to listen to you. I was born and raised in Brazil and have traveled extensively in the region, most recently in Chile. And I found last January in Chile to have been an incredibly interesting time. Of course, the history of Chile and U.S. involvement in Chile is exceedingly complex and controversial. But at the time we were there were still roving gangs of kids and armored vehicles chasing them around and shooting them with water cannons. And it led to a constitutional crisis and a promise that they would have a new constitution. Chile, of course, is an incredibly important country with regards to natural resources and so many other things. What is your view of the direction that Chile is going to be headed? Are they going to succeed in this thing? My second question for you was, how do you avoid cynicism and resignation given the experiences you've had in Latin America?
Yeah. I'll do the second one second, other than to start by saying as Larry mentioned, I've been an ambassador 3 times in Latin America, Chile, Venezuela, Colombia. And I have been known to say from time to time that it's like a sandwich, like my ambassadorial career, made of 2 excellent bits of French baguette, the finest bread you can find anywhere, but in the middle, a very complicated and not particularly tasty filling in between the 2 slices of bread. Chile, this is my view on Chile. Chile has reached the point that it is at. I believe probably the most highly educated country in Latin America. I believe the highest kind of median per capita income in Latin America, the best developed infrastructure in Latin America, a tax structure that makes sense and is actually enforced, a country that has one of the, if not the lowest crime rates in Latin America, with a police force, which despite what you saw, is actually by modern standards an under-policed country. If the operating assumption is, you should have a police officer like for every 40 or 30 or 40 citizens in most countries. In Chile, it's about 1/3 or 1/4 of that. Those are all good things. You also have, as you have seen, there is, since 1973, there has not ever been a challenged change of government, and the government has shifted from center-right to center-left parties back to center-right fairly consistently and peacefully now for more than 30 years. All of those are good things. Now, that said, one of the downsides, and remember, I'm old enough, I was not at college in the 1960s, but I was in college from 1970 on. And one of the downsides with having a lot of young people in university is, in fact, they're going to find things that they are dissatisfied with and that they wish to change. And Chile, I mean, the protests, I do agree there when it gets bad enough, there's water cannon and there's the rocks that are flying. There have not been, to the best of my knowledge, people going the next step up, and that is using literally deadly weapons to express their view or express their point. Even down in the South, which is where you do have a community that feels that they've got a 500-year-old grievance, and I'm talking about the Mapuche indigenous community down there. Even there, to the extent they're violent, it's basically waiting until the owners have left their house and then they burn the place down to express their disapproval of what is happening to their native communities. I personally predict that Chile will continue to be kind of the outlier out in front of the rest of the hemisphere because of the strength of its institutions. And I believe this is not to say that it will be paradise, happiness, and joy. It is not to say that elections will not be very vigorously contested and that people will from time to time call each other bad names. But I'll offer you one example, and then I'll close on Chile. While I was there from 2001 to 2004, there was an extremely strong position. I can't remember now who did it. It was one senator who suggested to the other senator that he was what we would say the equivalent in American English of an SOB, but he actually said the words that S would stand for, O would stand for, and B would stand for. Although he actually said it as an S, it was more of an SO, lady of the night. And in fact, there was a hushed silence, and no one actually had to say anything. At about the 2-minute mark, the gentleman who had said that turned to the other man and said publicly that he apologized to his mother because this was Chile, ladies and gentlemen. And if you're going to call somebody a son of a whore, which is fine. I mean, it's what they say all the time when they're expressing considerable annoyance with someone else. The truth of the matter is, he had not, in a sense, what he realized was that he had not insulted the man. He had insulted the man's mother. This is Chile. I cannot conceive of this happening anywhere else in Latin America. That's how strong I suggest the institutions are. Cynical, yeah, but keep in mind, brother, I've told you when I came in 1979, what Latin America looked like at that time. That was a time when you could be justified in feeling fairly pessimistic and fairly cynical. Exactly four civilian, non-military elected governments in the entire region. I mean, geez, Louise, that was the starting point. We are so far beyond that right now. We do have economies that largely work, not beautifully well everywhere, but for the most part work. We have elections that actually determine who the next government will be. You have legal systems that are, in fact, at least on the books and are enforced to some extent. Are there still a tremendous number of challenges? Yeah, but I'm one of those guys who says, hey, in my lifetime, what I saw back then compared to what I see right now, if you're looking at the entire movie, don't just give me the photograph of what things look like right now, but give me the 42-year-old movie. It's a pretty good movie from start to finish. That's how I control my cynicism.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Jay Wright. Good to see you. I'm not going to put Seth on the spot. He's presented several very thoughtful questions, and if you want to jump in, Seth, feel free. But two of them actually have been asked by some of the other participants, and so I'm going to focus on those two. and paraphrase them to include Seth's thoughts as well as Ray Montagno, one of our board members, and I think it was Ms. Duarte Sheffield that also was asking about the role that grassroots diplomatic organizations such as Rotary and Sister Cities and other NGOs might play in ameliorating some of the problems, particularly in Central America. I know Seth has traveled widely and has been involved in some of these grassroots organizations, particularly Sister City. And also I want to ask the question about, and this was something that was asked by others, what adjustments are being or should be made to the drug policies in view of gathering trend towards legalization of cannabis in the States? So can you think a little bit about those two? They're not along the same lines, but Seth teed them up, and I wanted to recognize his input as well as the fact that those were questions that others had.
Yeah. By the way, I think grassroots organizations both are important and can play a very important role. I think their role is, in my opinion and in my experience, they are most effective in countries where we are building a long-term relationship. In other words, it's not, I don't have much confidence in the input they can have in a country that is in genuine crisis. I would say, I would not encourage any such grassroots organization from the United States of America to try to do anything serious right now in Venezuela, as an example. I mean, the security situation doesn't permit it. There is no kind of counterpart that they can work with in Venezuela. And it's almost the same as suggesting that they go to Afghanistan or I don't know, Yemen at this particular point in time. If they can't even guarantee your security, there's probably not a great deal that you're going to be able to do. But that constitutes probably less than 10% of the Venezuelan community, the Latin American community, and the other 90%. I think they do excellent work. When I was ambassador, I found myself frequently going to events where a U.S. and its sister or brother organization in Chile, in Colombia, and in my days, still a few in Venezuela, would be doing something, and we were building relationships, and in fact, improving kind of the mutual impression and appreciation that the two societies had for one another. I mean, it could be something as simple. The one area where I had great success in connecting with Venezuelan people during my time, despite the efforts of President Chavez to keep me from having any positive relationships with anyone, it is one of the greatest grassroots organizations of the United States of America. You know what it was? It's a game of baseball. And in fact, it was a shared passion. And it opened a tremendous number of doors as I could get into these poor communities that had been kind of indoctrinated to look upon the United States of America as the enemy. And I could sit down and talk to them about baseball. Even better, I'd bring a certain amount of equipment and support youth leagues playing baseball in Venezuela. It is important. Do not be overly ambitious in terms of trying to get into the genuine crisis countries. That would be my only recommendation in terms of limits to how to be a grassroots organization operating in Latin America. Drugs and new policy. May I tell you, and I've been off and on working the drugs and law enforcement issues since I first went to the bureau that I eventually led in 1993, I guess, 93 to 95. So I've been, that's 28 years ago, and I've been working this issue at one point or another, both domestically in the US and overseas, particularly in Colombia, since that time. And I'd offer the following observation. US strategy, US policy should be constantly under review and constantly adjusted to deal with changing realities and changing facts on the ground. Sometimes those facts on the ground are kind of a surge of something new. 15 years ago, I would not, if you asked me what's my concern in the United States on drug abuse, I would not even have mentioned fentanyl. I'm not even sure I would have known what fentanyl was. And I would not have been particularly, prescient in terms of saying heroin is going to become a problem. I still would have said it's cocaine. And yet cocaine right now is probably number 4 on the list of US priorities in terms of drugs which are causing the most amount of damage to our society and our communities. At the top of that list would be fentanyl, because it is incredibly lethal and incredibly toxic, and a tiny amount of fentanyl can in fact kill you. Number 2 on the list would probably be heroin, which got to that position by supplanting cocaine, but also by supplanting the diversion of opioids, which went, as you know, through many communities, particularly in the mountain region of the eastern United States, and quite frankly, some towns and cities in the American Midwest in the second half of the last decade, of the decade before, the first decade of this century, and most of this past decade as well. It's opioids that was killing, that were being abused, and heroin kind of then came to occupy that terrain, because the traffickers discovered that they could offer the same amount of relief to those who were at that time taking opioids at only about 1/4 of the cost. That if you had to pay like $40 to get a Percocet tablet out on the street, you could get the same amount of value for $10 by a straight packet of heroin. Well, great deal. I mean, what could be better than that? So you've got fentanyl at the top, heroin in second, opioids before you get to cocaine. Now, did we adjust to this as quickly as we should have? No, we did not. Even today, do we have a real handle on how to control and manage the fentanyl crisis? I'm not sure we do. That's worth a review. Second, I do agree. The United States of America and the American people, through our own electoral processes, through plebiscites and other electoral means, are adjusting our policy on drug consumption and, to a certain extent, drug sale and purchase. And obviously, our policy has to take that into account. I had, in my last several years before I retired, I had to go to UN international meetings where I got some pushback from a number of countries who said, what gives? The United States has a treaty obligation under the UN drug conventions to enforce laws, including the laws against marijuana. And my response was, every country has a right, even under the convention, to enforce its laws consistent with its own realities. There is some discretionary authority that is granted by the conventions, and logic would suggest that we should focus on the large criminal organizations that surely all can agree should receive some degree of law enforcement attention, rather than worrying about whether one state has legalized marijuana and another state has not. But I don't want to let everyone off the hook too easily on this one. I do suggest to you that we want to do this intelligently. I regret, because I actually had an opportunity to make the argument back in 2012, shortly after the states of Colorado and Washington had voted in plebiscites, referendum, to be the first 2 states of the union to legalize, using that term, not decriminalize, but legalize the recreational use of marijuana and permit its sale and purchase with some conditions. And I argued in a meeting at the White House where I was heard out, and I said, I do believe the federal government should take some position on this, because at the end of the day, we will want to have something that resembles kind of common standards throughout the country in terms of how it happens. In other words, I was not opposing the concept of some degree of legalization. I was opposing the concept of 50, if you count Washington, D.C., 51 different states and jurisdictions doing it in different ways. And that some would focus perhaps on on emergency room impact, and others would not. Some would worry about proximity to schools or churches and synagogues and mosques, and others would not. Some would give the local town or city or county the authority to not permit the sale of marijuana, and others would not. And my only view was, if we could somehow come up with, at least, if not a formal standard, at least some guidelines to apply everywhere, that would be a good thing. But don't you all, those of you who are supporting legalization, don't worry about it. The big guy did not believe or accept what I said to him, and the federal government did not engage. That is the reality that we are going to be dealing with. My own view for the future is we should stay focused on the issues that are actually causing us concern. That today is not marijuana. Duh. I mean, that's the reason why 30 some odd states have legalized marijuana. It would be, I suggest, those products that are actually killing our people. Fentanyl, heroin, opioids, which we are getting a good handle on, I believe, and finally cocaine. And then figure what is the best way to deal with those. If it's not a heavily militarized kind of law enforcement activity, how is it that we can target those that are organized criminal syndicates who use blood and violence as their business model in order to make money by selling their product in the United States? That would be the argument I would make today.
Well, thank you. And we've had lots of good questions this evening and lots of participation. Really a good program. I want to thank you for sharing your evening with us. You sacrificed going out to dinner with your wife, I think.
And I'm starving, Larry. I'm starving.
Yeah, I know. You've told me not to keep you away from dinner for too long. But before we go, I'd mentioned earlier that you have a book coming out, and I wouldn't want to leave without you telling us a little bit about this book on the resolving the hostage crisis in Colombia. So, is it going to be available soon?
Oh, only because you're twisting my arm, Larry, will I offer no more than 60 seconds on this. Ladies and gentlemen, when it comes out, and I must admit, I've gotten diverted by the Venezuela crisis for the last 3 years, but when it comes out, it's going to be one of the coolest stories that you have ever read or heard about. And I say this not because of the brilliance of my book, which I hope will be brilliant and has great pictures, but because of what actually happened. And for those of you who have forgotten this, because it was a big news story, but that was 13 years ago. In the year 2008, in Colombia, the FARC guerrillas were holding literally hundreds of hostages. 15 they were holding as their special trophy hostages because they were trying to get to use them, to kind of sell them, if you will, for political or economic purposes. It included 3 Americans who had been working for the US Embassy before their plane went down, 1 French Canadian who had been a presidential candidate. You called her a him, Larry, earlier on. Ingrid Betancourt would not appreciate that. I have met her several times. She is very definitely a female. And 11 Colombian army and police officials, government officers, as well as some senior NCOs. And we had been trying to find our 3, plus a number of the others, for years. I mean, our guys had been in the jungle for 5.5 years. Some of the Colombians had been held for nearly 10 years in cages in the middle of the jungle. These are not good guys taking care of their prisoners. And we had been unable to locate them. We had had a near miss early in the year 2008. When, as the book will explain, we brought in kind of the specialists who do this sort of thing for a living, but we lost them in the jungle. And then some extremely smart guys who worked for Colombian military intelligence said, why don't we try a deception operation? Why don't we do a Trojan horse for the first time in whatever, 3,000 years or so? And what they did, and you'll have to read the book to get all the detail, but they intervened in the guerrillas' radio communications network. And they got some people who were able to mimic senior Colombian rebel officials and started giving orders to the FARC units that were holding the hostages, to move them and concentrate them in a specific area. And then once they were there, and we were quite nervous about this, as you can imagine, because it sounds so simple, and yet it seemed to be happening. Then the problem was how to get them out. And the final solution was take a Colombian Army helicopter and make it up as a make-believe NGO that does not exist, put a bunch of actors onto it who just also happen to be Colombian intelligence or military personnel, and they would impersonate the make-believe NGO or a doctor and two nurses or a Venezuelan news crew, and pursuant to the radio communications, they dropped into the middle of the FARC camp, and they got all 15 loaded onto the helicopter and flew them out. Not a shot was fired, not a drop of blood was shed. It was, as I said at the time, the coolest hostage rescue operation maybe since the dawn of time. Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. The book will be out ideally before I die of natural causes, although fortunately for me, I come from a family of people who live well into their 90s, so I've got a lot of time still to go. And if you're too cheap to buy the book when it comes out, I want you to know I'm going to try to write it in a way that, you know, maybe Netflix or HBO would say, hey, this might be worth doing a little series. Stand by. Colombia Hostage Rescue Operation 2008, the coolest thing I was ever involved in my 39 years of service.
Well, good. If that sounds interesting to everyone, this is the life that you think you might like to pursue, then you'll find in our chat box the contact information for diplomat in residence, Louis Finter, who is responsible for this part of the country for answering questions about careers in foreign service and helping them find good people to represent the United States in careers in the foreign service here and abroad. Finally, I'd like to make one more mention of the final Great Decisions gathering we're going to have on Tuesday, May 25th. The people who were involved in that series of programs this year voted to have one more informal kind of a discussion on a topic that was of most interest to them. And the title of the program when we held it was called The End of Globalization, ? And we want to have a further discussion about that. There'll be a short video that was provided by the Foreign Policy Association on the topic, and an article or two that you'll be able to read. And we want it to be an interesting give and take kind of discussion about whether people think it's a vexing problem or one of opportunity. So if you have thoughts about globalization and opinions and want to share them in a informal and respectful kind of a way, then we would love to have you participate. Betty Tonsing and Claire Collins have put their contact information in the chat box, and you can contact them if you would like to participate. So you can find more information about all of our programs on our Indiana Council on World Affairs website at indianaworld.org. And so for now, on behalf of the Indiana Council on World Affairs, we once more thank our distinguished speaker, Career Ambassador Bill Brownfield, as well as diplomat in residence, Louis Finter, Adebola Ogundipe, our technical host. She didn't have to use the hook on anyone tonight. Thank you all very much for your participation and your good questions. And I really want to thank everybody this evening for joining us, for participating. It was great to see members, guests, old friends, and everyone. Ambassador Brownfield, do you have a final word of farewell, or have you already logged off? I just saw you disappear from the screen.
No, brother, I'm still with you, but I have no final word other than to say thank you to all of you. And I reinforce the comment about anyone, particularly the younger among you, who is interested in an interesting career which I've never regretted for 39 straight years. Give it some serious thought. I have met very few people in the Foreign Service who did not enjoy the experience. Thank you all very much, and have a pleasant evening.
Thank you, Bill. We wish everyone a good evening, a good summer, a renewal of in-person contact, and return to your new normal. And we hope to see you all again next season. Please go to our website and join or rejoin. And with that, the season's out. Wish you all a pleasant summer and good night.